tube, an inner tube box from a tire. He twists it, and he comes up with a concept from, as you said, watching birds, okay? Because a lot of the books he read were, on animal flight. He comes up with the concept of wing warping, which today we call ailerons. And so he deduces that that's how birds turn, that they actually warp the ends of their wing. And he kind of plays around with this box. So he flies his kite in Dayton by himself, okay? He goes out there to a field outside of Dayton, flies his kite with three strings actually, two for wing warping and one for the center, and he actually navigates the kite that way. So this proves to him this theory of wing warping works. Now he's got to build a glider. So he does. He builds one above the bike shop. Orville's not involved at this point. He's just not. But also, Wilbur does something that will change his life. He writes a letter to a guy named Octave Chanute. Octave Chanute is the leading aeronautical scientist of the time, and he writes him back and says, I approve of your theories. And in fact, this begins a 500-letter correspondence where these two men take on the head-cracking physics of flight, which nobody had done before, because all the numbers will turn out to be wrong that everybody's been working with. But Orville and Octave Chanute are the two guys who are really working in tandem to work this out. Anyway, so he builds his glider. He determines he wants to go to Kitty Hawk, and then he alone goes down to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and almost gets killed in the journey because, if you go down to Kitty Hawk at that time, there's no bridge. You have to go to the Outer Banks. You have to cross the Albemarle Sound. There was a storm. But he is alone at this point. So Orville is really not involved. Now, Orville will come down and join him, okay? But Wilbur will make all the flights all the way up to 1902. And this is something that people don't understand. Orville, was pretty much acting on Wilbur said, let's do this, let's do that, let's do this. And, so this was his mission. This was his raison d'etre. This was his mission in life to crack flight, not Orville's. If Wilbur had said, what, I'm not going to do this flight thing anymore, Orville would have been just fine continuing with the bike business. I mean, he was more of a businessman. Wilbur was not.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. When you were looking at family letters and other archives, are there any things that really stick out in your mind of saying, okay, this shows me that Wilbur was operating on a different level and way more engaged than Orville was?
The family letters, and just so your listeners know, I use the papers of Wilbur and Orville Wright. They're about 2 bound editions, probably 1.5 feet tall. And in there are the family letters. Now, the letters that Orville wrote, primarily to Catherine and others, described a lot of the day-to-day life in the camp in, Kitty Hawk. Okay. Wilbur's letters are all technical. Okay. They're mostly the letters that he writes. The big letters are between him and Octave Chanute. And here's where Wilbur does not go to his brother Orville and say, hey, I'm trying to figure this thing out. And to be fair, Orville would work with him on some problems, okay? But he went primarily to Octave Chanute in the heavy-duty, again, working out the math, the physics of flight, because nobody had lift correct. I'm going to segue back to Langley now. Langley did build his big plane. All right, so Langley built his big plane. We had the little steam engine thing he had. He goes down again to the Potomac. All the press is there. A guy named Benchley is going to fly it. And the plane takes off and crashes. Just goes like a brick down into the Potomac. Langley is disgraced. And so then he builds a second one. And it does it again. And, and actually it's got to do with Beachley. And Beachley almost drowns. And Langley is disgraced. The Smithsonian is disgraced. And that's in about 1902, 1903. Okay, so really, the Smithsonian had it shot, and they lost $50,000. The government's mad as hell because their money was wasted on this brick. And so now The only guys that are really close to flying would be Wilbur and Orville. And of course, to the world, they see the Wright brothers, but in fact, this is Wilbur who's moving toward this concept of flight. Because here's the big difference. The big difference was everybody else assumed a plane was like a train, that it went right down a track, that flying was inherently stable. Wilbur said, no, flying is inherently unstable, and you have to compensate. So everybody else was thinking, no, you build a big enough engine, and Langley had a 50 horsepower engine, which was huge at the time, and you can fly, okay? So it's just a matter of you point that thing and go. Wilbur was like, no, absolutely not. Flight is unstable. And so he had to develop the ailerons. He had to develop the rudder. He had to develop the elevator, So there you have the three, triad of control that, in fact, when you go to the patent for the Wright brothers, it's not a patent on an airplane. It's a patent on a method of control. Other men had flown, jumping off the side of buildings or cliffs or whatever, and then they come down, they crash, they only fly for a little bit. Wilbur was the first man to have controlled flight, and that's where he diverged from everyone.
Yeah, you can go back to, I think, the 11th century with a monk who flew a glider off of a bell tower in a monastery. So the idea is there, right, but control is the big one. Orville, he has a fight at some point with the Smithsonian Institute and Glenn Curtiss. Is that after they successfully fly their plane?
Yeah, okay. So and so that factors into Langley. So let's go back to Langley. Okay, Langley's disgraced. Glenn Curtiss is a guy who kind of a ne'er-do-well, but very smart guy. He builds motors for a long time. Then he gets into the flight business, building motors for airplanes. And then he starts to build planes. And he comes up to the Wright brothers and says, hey, I can build, motors for you. And they meet, and they kind of like each other. But here's Curtiss's view on things. Curtiss believed that patents didn't apply. That if you developed an idea, it was like the air. It came from God, and nobody could just patent it. The Wright brothers, worked for years to get their patent on flight, and everybody who flew then had to pay them a royalty because they used their system of control. Well, Curtiss said, that's crazy. There's a thing called a pioneer patent, and that's what the Wright brothers got. Okay. So Wilbur, they get in a big court fight with Curtiss. Wilbur dies. All right. Curtiss figures out, he says, you know what, the only way, I'm going to be bankrupt soon because I can't make planes without paying these guys. The only way I can do is break their patent, their pioneer patent. I'm going to go back and look at Langley's plane and say that plane could fly. So he approaches a guy named Wolcott over at the Smithsonian and says, listen, I'm going to redo the 1903 flyer, or the 1896 flyer of Langley, the Langley plane. I think it can fly. I think it was capable of flight. So what does Curtiss do? He makes alterations with current technology. They fly it. The Smithsonian then publishes a report saying, you know what? Our plane was first. Langley, in fact, had a plane that could fly. It was just a pilot error. But, in fact, they were the first ones to build a plane. They published that. Orville is furious. Okay, he's furious. He said, and the Smithsonian wanted the 1903 flyer. And so Orville says, you know what? I'm sending it over to London, and they're going to exhibit it in the London Museum over there, and I'm not bringing it back until you retract everything you've said and say that I built the first airplane capable of powered flight. And the Smithsonian says, absolutely not. Why? Because they're resurrecting Langley and their reputation from the big fiasco. All right? So he puts it on a steamer, and he ships the 1903 flyer, and for 20 years it sits over in Britain. Everybody wants it back. FDR, Lindbergh, all these people plead with Orville. Orville's like, no, not until they publish a retraction, basically saying they were wrong, that this whole thing was, something made up by Curtiss, and Curtiss made these alterations, and that we had the first plane. It took all the way to 1948 for that plane to finally come back. Orville dies, and in his will is a letter Because what happens is, and this is where Kelly comes in again, this is where all this stuff dovetails. Kelly is afraid that Orville won't let him publish his book still. So he goes to the Smithsonian and says, look, I'm going to publish all this stuff that's been going on with Smithsonian, and everybody's going to know it. And Smithsonian then says, okay, you know what? Fine, we'll give in. And they give in. And they publish a treatise saying that the Wright brothers were first and that, in fact, Langley's plane could not fly. Orville dies, but he leaves behind a letter. And in the letter it says, I bequeath the 1903 flyer to the Smithsonian. You can bring it back from Britain. By the way, all through World War II, the flyer was in Britain. They had to take it outside and put it in a town down below ground to protect it because the Germans were bombing the hell out of it. Okay, which, irony upon irony, the very technology that they developed is up above trying to destroy the 1903 flyer. So this letter says, basically, you can have the flyer, but if you ever think anybody ever flew before us, it's going to be yanked out again, and you won't be able to exhibit it. And so in 1948, it finally came back to America. It was shipped away in 28. So for 20 years, the plane that cracked the Rubicon of flight, that is responsible for human flight, was not in the United States for 20 years.
Okay, so I want to jump back to the moment where they are successful in 1903. Interestingly enough, seem to operate in stealth mode for a number of years, and it seems like they don't become international celebrities till, I think, 1908 in France, when they make a bunch of public demonstrations. So they're in what they would call in Silicon Valley stealth mode for 5 years. Orville, is he still kind of Wilbur's lackey, for a lack of a better term, or does his role change, and does this affect the perception?
That's a good question. I mean, they are both now. In the great tragedy of the Wright brothers is they had to go right to monetizing their plane. Think about this. They invent this thing. Nobody knows how to monetize it. How do you make money with it? Okay, they stop the whole bicycle shop. They stop all that, and they say, this is how we're going to make our money. So they're kind of more partners in the business part of it, but immediately they have a problem getting a patent because, all these other people try to put in patents for flying machines, and, the U.S. Patent Office is like, well, I don't see how this is going to work, and they have to keep getting patent attorneys to try and present a correct patent that the United States will say, you and only you are the ones who invented flight. Add to this the fact that a lot of newspapers didn't cover their flight, and a lot of newspapers just didn't believe them. And every time they had reporters out to Dayton to fly in that cow field, the plane wouldn't fly. So there was a lot, and especially overseas in France. When this Daily Mail article came out, you look at the comments, they all still believe that, Europeans, invented flight first. But in France, there's like a headline, flyers are liars. So they had multiple problems, and they were paranoid. They were super paranoid that other people would catch up to them. Now, Wilbur believed, and rightly so, that the breakthrough he had made because of the technology that he developed using a wind tunnel and finding the correct coefficients for lift, nobody else had done that, and he was right there. Okay, so he knew it would take them a while to do it. But still, they were super paranoid, and that's why they went to, like you say, stealth mode, where they were keeping it hidden. They're trying to sell it to the government, trying to sell it to the army. The United States was like, we aren't that interested in it. And France was more interested in buying it than the United States was, because the government, United States had been burned with Langley. And they were just like, this ain't going to really work. And so, they were constantly trying to build this plane, a new plane, that would be more stable and they could actually sell. At the same time, they're trying to fight to get a patent. They're trying to make sure that nobody else knows about it. So, they basically for for 5 years, are basically kind of operating under the radar. And this is making a lot of people go, well, they didn't really fly. How do we know this? This picture, these pictures, what are these? So they were really, rolling the dice in a way, saying, we have this thing and we can make a lot of money on it, but, we can't talk about it. And, there's a lot of people say that was a big mistake, because They basically sort of sat